welcome to Daily Debrief brought to you by People's Dispatch. I am Shriya, and in today's episode we bring to you the 5 crucial resolutions of the UN General Assembly on Palestine, the latest update from the Qatar World Cup, and the Biden-Macron meet in Washington this week. On November 30, the United Nations General Assembly adopted 5 resolutions on Palestine that hold significance for the Palestinian struggle. The Assembly called for an immediate halt to all settlement activities, demanded the release of prisoners and an end to arbitrary arrests and detentions of Palestinians. The Assembly has decided to commemorate the 75th year of the Nakba in 2023. In a significant move, the UNGA has also declared Israel's 1981 decision to impose Israeli jurisdiction on the Syrian Golan Heights as null and void. Prashant from People's Dispatch is here with us in the studio for more. So Prashant, what is the significance of all these resolutions? They cover a lot.
So Shriya, you mentioned 5 resolutions, of which 3 of them are specifically to be borne in mind. The one which has probably got the most attention has to do with commemorating the 75th anniversary of the Nakba next year. Now we know that the Nakba is very central to the Palestinian struggle. It is a recognition of the fact that if you look, for instance, at the Israeli imagination, Israel likes to portray as if there was basically empty land lying there and people came from across the world and they set up Israel. Whereas the truth is that there was a vibrant and substantial Palestinian Arab population over there. These people were basically pretty much evicted from their homelands in which they had been living for generations. They ended up being refugees in the whole region, even in other parts of the world. And even now, the right to return of those who were evicted remains a very central point to the Palestinian struggle. So, the mention of the Nakba itself is actually a nod to all these aspects which remain very central to the Palestinian struggle today. And it is one of the issues Israel has continuously, under even so-called moderate governments, continued to resist, the recognition of the fact that during the formation of Israel, so many hundreds of thousands of people were displaced, and they and their descendants together today comprise millions of people. So, which is why Israel has been so opposed to this idea, of course. Then, like you mentioned, the other key aspect is the Golan Heights. Again, a very important historic aspect because the Golan Heights were taken over by Israel in the 1967 war from Syria. In 1991, they declared their control over it, or the sovereignty over it, which is not recognized by anybody. It was internationally not recognized. Important to note that in 2019 or so, I believe, the Trump administration recognized Israel's jurisdiction over the Golan Heights, and this was in violation of all international norms, just like the Trump administration also declared Jerusalem to be Israel's capital. So that's still a very contested area. The Golan Heights have been used by Israel to mount continuous attacks on Syria as well. So very important strategic area. So it's interesting that the United Nations actually mentions this aspect. And the third thing has to do with something we've talked about often on this show. It's about illegal settlements. It's about administrative detention, the kind of arbitrary arrest of prisoners. And Israel keeps extending these arrests without, even if there is no, it doesn't have to present any evidence on many of these arrests. It can say that there are some secret charges, and people continue to be in jail for years, and they may be briefly released, again be rearrested. These arrest durations can be renewed every 6 months, what is called administrative detention. So all of these are aspects that these resolutions have highlighted, of course. Important to note that, for instance, the Nakba resolution, 90 countries voted in favor, but key countries like the US and many of its allies voted against. And this pretty much marks a continuation of the trend whereby on the Palestinian issue, the vast majority of countries in the global south, the vast majority of countries in Asia and Africa have historically continued to stick by the Palestinian people. They've shown solidarity with the Palestinian people, whereas the Israeli occupation has always been backed by the Western powers for decades right now. And this backing, it's all the more, needs to be called out all the more now because atrocities by Israel continue to increase.
Right, and that was the historical significance. But for the region, what does these resolutions mean politically?
Right. See, that's a very important question because I think one of the problematic aspects of the United Nations right now is that a lot of its efforts do not have, there's no teeth. So although, for instance, we've seen this in the case of Cuba, we've seen this in the case of, for instance, Palestine as well, that although vast majority of countries are in favor of Palestinian sovereignty, have expressed solidarity with the Palestinian peoples, just a small number of, because the UN General Assembly itself does not have any kind of mandate in any sense. What really matters is that as long as Israel has the backing of the US and Western allies, it's able to continue its oppressive policies, it's able to continue its apartheid policies. Now, this resolution comes, like we've talked about often on this show, this resolution comes during a year which has been, by historical standards, very brutal for Palestinians, the largest number of Palestinians killed since 2004, I believe. And, this is under a so-called liberal government. There have been huge announcements regarding new settlements. We know that a more right-wing Israeli government is coming to power under Benjamin Netanyahu, where the religious right is going to be far more enshrined. Some of their proposals call for further extending these illegal settlements, these illegal outposts, further legalizing these oppressive structures. So all in all, while these resolutions are, interesting, the decision to commemorate the Nakba is very significant in some ways. The Jolan Heights resolution is also maybe significant. But when it comes to actual translation on the ground, the UN is largely reduced to a mere aid-providing agency. All it can do is try, if its donor countries are able, do manage to cough up the money to provide some kind of relief to Palestinians who are struggling on a day-to-day basis. Other than that, their word does not really have any legitimacy on the ground, and it is left to ordinary Palestinians to struggle against Israeli occupation, which is what they have been doing for decades and which is what they continue to do today.
Thank you so much, Prashant. We'll be back with you for another story. And at the ongoing FIFA Men's Football World Cup in Qatar, a tournament we have been covering regularly on the show, there has been plenty of drama on the pitch and plenty of controversy off it. But a leitmotif has been the sense of unity among Arab and Asian fans attending the event in large numbers, something not previously seen at the world's biggest sporting event. Fans from around the region have also united in solidarity with the people of Palestine and the Palestinian cause. Siddhant Annie, who is in Qatar at the moment, joins us with the latest from the field. Hi Siddhant, thank you for joining us. So the group stage is almost at an end. It's been both exciting and unpredictable. What do you think lies ahead in the tournament now?
It's hard to say or make any predictions. Like you were saying, Shreya, it's been a World Cup full of surprises so far, for multiple reasons, I think. But like last night was a really exciting set of games. Very unexpectedly in a group that contains two European powerhouses, in that sense, Croatia and Belgium. Morocco went ahead and topped that group to qualify as the #1 team from their group. And then a little bit later on, even perhaps more unexpectedly, Japan, who had a few days ago beaten Germany, beat Spain 2-1 in the late game, and they went on to top their group. So that group contains two former world champions, of course, Spain and Germany, who have won the World Cup, I think, 4 times. So a lot of surprises being thrown up by this tournament as we get through each stage of games, actually. The only unsurprising, I suppose, progression so far have been Brazil and France, and to some extent Portugal as well, Cristiano Ronaldo's side. All three most likely will top their groups and look quite comfortable and quite set to make a deep run. But we have high expectations. Australia also making it through to the next round. We're hoping today in the evening that Ghana play well against Uruguay. So a very exciting tournament so far, Shreya. On the pitch, of course, and as well as off it, lots of storylines continually emerging.
Right. And there's also solidarity among fans that's coming on Palestine. I mean, can we talk a little bit about that, about how fans are expressing solidarity, mostly Asian, African fans, they are expressing solidarity about Palestine?
Yeah, absolutely. And it, of course, Palestine is one major cause behind which I think from across the region, people have kind of banded together and showed their support. We've seen, of course, Gianni Infantino claimed that there are special flights that are being arranged from Palestine, bringing in Palestinian fans. Whatever little evidence I have gathered in speaking to these Palestinians who've come in on these flights, of course, none of them want to be named and such, as well as speaking to some Israeli journalists who were, willing to talk on the subject, again, without being named or mentioned or the agencies really being talked about. They say that it's more Israeli Arab Israelis who are coming in. So they're citizens of Israel who are perhaps belong to the more affluent class there. I was speaking to someone who comes from or has come in from East Jerusalem, occupied East Jerusalem. He confirmed this. A couple of fans actually confirmed this. So we saw in the games that Morocco played against, I forget who they played, but also in the game between Tunisia and France at the 48th minute to sort of symbolize the 1948 Nakba. Massive sort of flags were raised in support of Palestine, and the fans chanted. In fact, in the Tunisia-France game, there was even someone who jumped onto the pitch with a Palestinian flag. He was, of course, very quickly surrounded by stewards and escorted off the pitch. But unlike what happened a few days earlier, he was treated much better. So even the authorities have some amount of regard for the Palestinian cause, even if it is somewhat superficial. So it kind of reflects the difference between what the people feel, the people of this region, particularly Arab people as well as some Asians, about the Abraham Accords and the process of normalizing of relations with the state of Israel. While several governments are making it a point to say this is the way forward, etc., etc. People recognize that a lot of that comes with strings attached. It's because the same governments are also selling things to the United States, buying things from the United States, particularly military equipment and things like that. And because of that, they are sort of very vocal about expressing their solidarity with the Palestinian people. In Souk Waqif, which is like the old souk in what could be called Central Doha, where now kind of there are several restaurants and shops and things like that. And so in the evenings, all the fans kind of descend on that area. They march down the streets, singing songs, dancing, and all of that. We've seen almost on a nightly basis people from across the region, whether it's Morocco, Tunisia, even Saudi, getting together and chanting for Palestine and making it a point to sort of bring up the cause there. So it has been one of the stories of, I think, unity in a World Cup that has otherwise been divided along many lines. And the fact that the demographic of this World Cup, like Saudi Arabian fans, are the maximum in number in terms of people who have come in from outside, followed, of course, by Indians. So the fact that the demographic is so different. Yesterday in the Japan-Spain game, for example, the Spanish fans were outnumbered, and just like on the pitch, even off the pitch in the stands, the fans won that kind of singing, chanting, noise battle that happens. And it was we saw what it did in terms of lifting the team to perform also. So all of these things making for a very different vibe and energy at this World Cup, something we've not seen before, and perhaps something that in the near future, especially as the World Cup expands rather into a 48-team format, we might not see again in the near future.
Rightly said, Siddhant. We'll soon be back with you on more updates. Thank you so much for joining us. French President Emmanuel Macron is in Washington on a state visit, the first that the Biden administration will be hosting. The relationship between the two Western powers has been on and off lately, but seems to be coming together on the issue of the war in Ukraine. Prashant joins us again with more details. Prashant, how do we see this meeting between these two powers right now at this point of time?
Right, of course. Just to set the context, there are 2 or 3 important things we need to note. First of all, the ties between France and the United States have varied. We know that, I believe last year or so, the United States pretty much scuttled a French deal for submarines with Australia by forming what is called the AUKUS group. The French were, needless to say, very, very angry. In fact, I believe they withdrew their ambassador also. Similarly, in 2021, we know that France was one of the countries also critical after the Afghanistan fiasco happened. And there were, at some point of time, there was speculation that French and US interests were diverging considerably. And, there was all this talk about, what is going to be the future of Europe? Will it align closer to the rest of Asia in some senses? Will it be more of Eurasia, or will they try to continue to stick with the United States? Of course, a lot of this was changed by the war in Ukraine, when we know that the European powers and the United States moved much more closer together. NATO became, in some senses, more coherent, which means more subservient to US interests. And that is what has been going on for the past few months. Now, this is despite the fact that you could argue that in the medium to long run, this course of action is actually quite harmful to European interests in various ways. Because for one thing, we do know that Europe's energy requirements have suffered considerably because of this war and because of the fact that they have joined in with the United States on sanctions on Russia. For instance, the fact that the Nord Stream pipelines have been sabotaged is definitely a blow to Europe in the long run, and there's a lot of questions about how Europe's energy needs are definitely going to be met. So this is one aspect that we need to consider. Now, the other aspect, of course, in the context of the Ukraine war itself, broadly, France and the United States have been on the same page. France has maybe shown a bit more inclination to negotiate with the Russians. I think Macron has time and again sort of indicated that he's far more open to it than the Americans have at various points of time. And I believe this is also part of a strategy where you have your more rigid partner and you have the more so-called ally who is amenable to negotiations. So that's pretty much the broader context in which this happens. This also happens at a time when relationships between Europe and the United States are kind of fraught over economic issues as well, because the Inflation Reduction Act, which is one of the Joe Biden administration's central planks, it has been seen as being discriminating against European industry because it wants to favor US industry. So that's an issue that the European governments have had a huge amount of problems over. So these three aspects are the three important things to note during the context of these meetings. I mean, there'll be the usual, and the meeting took place, of course. There were the usual slogans, declarations of friendship. But these are the three important pillars to mark at a time when this meeting is taking place.
So, more on the Ukraine war, how is this meeting going to pan out the course of the war?
Right. So, I wouldn't say that there is any major change that this meeting brings, or for that matter, the US and NATO larger strategies. We know that recently there was a NATO meeting which continued to say that we will continue support as usual for Ukraine. And I think that there has been some amount of hardening of stances from both sides. Russia has intensified its attacks on the one hand. From the West, we have seen the usual familiar statements. So while at some points a while ago there was some talk about a thaw, some talk about the possibility of negotiations, I think we've sort of gone back from there. We do know there is a strong possibility that Russia will launch a winter offensive, which might be specifically focusing on the Donbas regions. So that's also very much on the cards. So what we're unfortunately looking at is probably a period of much more conflict, much more warfare. I don't think there's going to be too much of a change in that. And as far as this alliance is concerned, for the Western alliance is concerned, for the United States, I think the key focus is to ensure that the European countries continue to support the US in its offensive, in its strategies, as far as encircling goes, both Russia and China for that matter. Whereas I think for European leaders, a key question is that their own people are not exactly very happy with the situation right now because of the economic difficulties, because of the impact of the fact that winter is here, the energy is a big problem. And I think there is a much more weariness among the populations in Europe about this kind of the conflict continuing than in the US, which is distant, or where the economic impact has not yet been much felt. So I think the United States is going to keep trying again and again to sort of ensure that the European governments, the European leadership, the European ruling class is very much aligned to its policies, and I think that is how the United States sees it. And I think the Europeans are also trying to maybe use this to sort of extract some amount of economic concessions wherever possible as well, because they're extremely worried about the future of their economies because of the larger energy crisis.
Thank you, Prashant. We'll keep following this with you. Thank you for joining us. That's all we have for today. For more such stories, keep following peoplesdispatch.org. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram.